The West is something that's always intrigued me. I sometimes say that in the United States, we don't have a long history like you have in Europe. We don't have a fairy lore. We don't have a medieval history. So the closest thing we have, at least for white people, the closest thing we have to a mythology or a fairy lore is the Western, the classical Western.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between, or beyond. Today I'm here with Frederic S Durbin. A native of rural central Illinois, Frederic was writing before he could read, though that period of his work is largely misunderstood. In school, he loved English, acting, singing, and band. In college, he devoured mythology and English literature and majored in classical languages. He spent over 20 years in Japan teaching English as a second language and writing. Now returned to the U.S., he continues to spin tales of fantasy for children and adults. His novel, A Green and Ancient Light, won the Realm Award and was named a Reading List Honor Book by the American Library Association, and a Year's Best Fantasy by Publishers Weekly. Recently, he serves as a co-editor for the Cold Hard Type Fiction Anthology series from Loose Dog Press. If he could create his ideal writing space, it would be a well-lighted desk in a vast cavern chamber or in the depths of a forest beside a waterfall. Frederic, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So you've spent time in Japan over 20 years, and I've had a number of guests on the show who have spent time, especially in the Far East. Japan and Korea seem to be common. And my wife and I are very curious to visit there at some point. So what was it like there? 22 years, that's a long time.
It is a long time. Well, it's a very easy country to live in, generally quite safe. It's easy to get around. I enjoyed it a lot, just perspective of a very different culture. And, I'm interested in the literature, and especially for me as a writer, some of the ghostly lore and folklore of Japan fascinated me. But I obviously enjoyed the experience because I was there for 22 years. I was teaching during that time and really enjoyed it, made close friends, enjoyed the country and the culture and learning the language.
Oh, excellent. Did you see a lot of change during that time in the Japanese culture? Did it, and I'm curious if it came sort of closer to, let's say, America or further away?
I did see a lot of change during that time. For one thing, as I think in many ways it became closer to America, and the Japanese became much more used to a foreign presence in Japan. When I first went there in the fall of 1988, I was pretty rare. There weren't a whole lot of foreigners, so I was still a wonder for kids to see. Like, they would stare at me. There would be these whispers of gaijin, gaijin, which means outsider or foreigner. And that really changed during the 20 years. There were a lot more Westerners going to Japan. I noticed as the nutrition changed in the Japanese diet, people got taller. I
Okay.
was I was at my full height when I went to Japan at about age 23. I noticed at first my students in college were shorter than me, and then over the years they gradually passed me up.
That's
So
interesting. So what do you think it was in the diet that changed? Is it like the amount of, I've heard suggestions in some places, the amount of meat, for example, or the amount
probably, unfortunately, I'm afraid the diet probably got worse in some ways for the Japanese because they have one of the healthier diets in the world. So yeah, I suppose a lot of things like pizza and meat and fast food and things
of
like
that. I don't know if that's a good, well, I don't know if we should be pushing that selling point that fast food
exactly
makes you bigger. Well, I mean, it
right.
makes you bigger, but
It makes
taller
you
is a
bigger,
weird
not
one. Yeah.
necessarily in height vertically.
Yeah, no, exactly. Do you go back regularly to Japan at all?
No, I left in 2011. In fact, I left within about 24 hours of that major disaster in Fukushima, the tsunami and the
Hmm.
nuclear problem. And I've been back just once since then. My wife and I were able to go back once for a visit about 4 or 5 years ago.
All right. Okay. Did you leave because of the disaster or
No, no.
was
In
it
fact, I
coincidental?
when I left, everything was fine, and I had no idea that was going on. And then when I got to the coast of America, people were asking me, "Well, what about the earthquake? Are you okay?" And I had no idea, but it was on all the news stations and all the newspapers.
Wow, that's good timing then.
Yes, I guess so.
So you have been back for a while, apparently long enough to come up with your ideal writing space, which I found was quite interesting. So it's either very idyllic or almost seems like a supervillain lair, depending on which one you choose.
Oh,
So
okay.
what made you think of that particular type of ideal writing space?
When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I think my parents took me to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky, which I believe is still the longest known cave system in the world in terms of length of passageways. And there's still a lot that they don't know about there yet. They're still exploring it. But I think that vacation, that trip to Mammoth Cave, was hugely influential for me. I often say that in one way or another, I've been writing about it ever since because my writing does tend to have secret worlds, underground worlds, these large cavernous spaces, whether it's a physical space in the earth or whether it's the interior of some kind of giant ship or something. I love the mystery of hidden spaces. So I think it would be really fun to have a creative space in an environment like that.
So did that, and you did have a number of caves in your book that we'll be talking about, The Country Under Heaven. That was inspired by that the trip then?
In one way or another. I wasn't consciously thinking of Mammoth Cave, but I'm sure it's deep in my psyche.
Excellent. I'm just curious because I'm not familiar with Mammoth Cave. Is it a natural cave system or is it?
Yes, it's a natural limestone cave system, and it's one that has a lot of variety. There are sections that are both a dry, dead cave that's no longer growing, and so you get these enormous passageways like subway tunnels almost. But then it also has living parts that are still flowing and slowly growing over hundreds and thousands of years. So there's a little bit of every environment there, from the very large to the very narrow and confined. And there's even an underground river that people can ride boats on.
Oh,
So just
interesting.
an amazing environment. We're used to, if we visited caves, we're used to going down into a cave and then coming back up. But the longest tour at Mammoth Cave is actually a journey underground of about 4 miles or 5 miles. And you go in at one entrance, you make this journey, and you come out at an entirely different exit, and they have to bus you back to your car.
Wow, okay.
So
So
it
I see.
reforms your way of thinking about caverns.
Yeah, yeah. Because I was wondering, in places like Turkey, they have discovered some
Oh
man-made
yeah,
caverns. I was just wondering, have you ever thought to set a story, or maybe you already have set a story in a cave system underground?
there is one novel I have that's an unpublished novel. It's still on the drawing board, but it's set entirely in an underground world, and it has a lot of challenges in a world where there is no natural light. How do you handle things like seeing for
Yeah,
characters sitting around? So it's been a
exactly.
lot of fun to play with what a culture might look like in an underground space.
Yeah, it's interesting. Was that a human culture as well? So
Basically, yeah,
you
they're
have the
basically
why that they're there
humans.
as well. Yeah.
No, they're humans that have adapted to thousands of years underground.
Interesting. So in your story, I mean, we're not talking about that particular story, but I am curious a little bit if you don't mind sharing a few points about it. But what was the impetus for them to go underground in your?
I don't know that the book ever explains it. It's just given because they've been down there for so long, and they do have some traffic with the outside world. So there are two groups of people. The people of the underground are called the Hurlim people, and then the people of light are called the Vin. And so the Vin do have their sunlight-based eyesight. The Hurlim people have a sense that they call Illa, which is an energy flowing through the earth that they're receptive to. So it allows them to see depth and texture. It doesn't allow them to see colors because colors are
Hmm.
a function of light.
Right.
So, yeah,
Oh,
but I assume they were fleeing for something or looking for something.
yeah, that's interesting. So because you're writing, and we will get into it in a moment into your sort of path to writing, but so it is published under science fiction to a degree. It does sort of seem to straddle the line between science fiction and fantasy, which I guess that's not a strange thing necessarily, as they have common elements, and you seem to sort of work with those common elements within what I'd say a mundane setting, a fairly normal setting where you then incorporate those. Is that something you consciously done, like sort of walking that ambiguity?
I do like walking that ambiguity. And I think as I've aged, as I've grown as a writer, my settings have become closer to the real world. When I was a young guy, I was writing about fantastic worlds that were completely different, more like Tolkien's Middle Earth or something, where you have, different land, different creatures. And I think over the years, it's become much closer to magical realism, where it's basically our world, but there's some fantastic element to it.
Do you think that's a function of age and sort of interest changing? Because I find myself moving. I mean, my writing is still, when I do it, very sort of space epic science fiction, although I do have some down to earth stuff as well. But my interests personally have definitely shifted towards more, like, would say, reality kind of based stuff. Is that something do you think is a function of age or just your experience with writing?
I think it probably is to a certain extent. When you start out writing as a young person, you're just giddy with the idea that you can create anything. You can do whatever you want, make something entirely new. And then as you go through life, you begin to realize how full of stories the world is. And you have experiences and relationships and various things go on. And you want to tell those stories more and more, I think. At least that's the way it's worked for me.
Excellent. I guess before we move much further, I did note when we were doing the preamble before this that you have a bunch of manual typewriters in the background in your office. You mentioned you like collecting typewriters. I don't know if you could comment a bit on that.
Sure. Yeah, I suppose that would, if I had to name a hobby, it's probably working with vintage manual typewriters. I've been fascinated by them for, well, since about 2015. The Christmas of 2015, my wife got me a typewriter as a surprise Christmas present. And right away, I was hooked. I started studying all I could about them, collecting them. Now I have a collection that is close to 100 typewriters.
Wow.
Now,
Jeez.
most of those are portables and they are stored in cases. They can be kept in a closet. So I don't want to give you the picture that you can't walk through our house because there are typewriters everywhere. The rule is now that if I bring one in, one has to go out because we're
So there's
about
that
maxed
many.
out at the number of typewriters. But
Yeah.
I love using them. I'm primarily interested in that typewriters as writing machines. I'm not really a collector of rare, valuable typewriters like some people are. I've used them a lot in classrooms. In fact, I teach high school at a school for the performing arts in the writing and publishing department. And I just offered a course. I designed and offered this course called Analog Writing. And the students did all of their writing on manual typewriters. So we
Wow.
tried to get them completely off screens and off their phones and digital devices. It was really a course about how to concentrate and think deeply and focus on one thing at a time, which is something I think the current generation, and not just kids, but all of us, that's something we really are struggling with and lacking.
Yeah, it seems like your course is a bit of a detox course as well, then.
Yes,
Digital
digital
detox.
detox.
Yeah. Do you actually use any of them for your own novel writing?
I use typewriters for things every day. I don't actually use them for my fiction. I'm right of the age where when I started writing, about the time I graduated from college, we got word processors. So I really came of age as a writer with a digital keyboard. And I love being able to make those instant changes in the first draft stage. So I wouldn't want to entirely go back to typewriters, but I do use them a lot for planning. A lot of times I make my lesson plans on a typewriter. I
Hmm.
do a lot of correspondence, writing typewritten letters to people. And I keep a daily journal, a typewritten journal.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I have noticed a little bit of an interest in going back to sort of that the manual style, slowing it down a bit. I know a performance poet who uses a manual typewriter. And
Mhm.
my last guest, Alexander Boldazar, his profile picture has him up to his waist in ice water in the forest with a manual typewriter on the ice.
Wow.
So quite interesting.
That is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it was an interesting story how he got it there as well. He had to lug it through the forest.
Yeah, that's dedication, I think.
Yeah, there, yeah, exactly. So again, you are a novelist, but you have just recently switched over to, not switched over, but at least put on the editor's hat for a little bit. I'm curious because I've published some anthologies myself years ago, and it was an interesting experience from that side of the table, as it were, reading through the submissions, seeing how people do exactly what they're not supposed to do all the time. I don't know. Wonder what experiences you've had with this process so far and some of the more notable things you might have encountered.
I know what you're talking about. It is interesting the things that people will write and turn in on a submission. I noticed the reluctance of people to make changes. I think that's something we have to learn early on as writers if we're going to survive in the business at all, is you have to not treat your work like it's the holy word of God graven in stone tablets. You have
Right.
to be able to make changes. And we noticed that when we would ask for editorial changes, a lot of people would not really make them.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost a sign of professionalism in a way, the willingness to make those changes. And you can
Yes.
almost sort of filter people out almost on that basis alone.
Yeah. I mean, I'm grateful for the chance to work with a good editor that knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Have you had
But
any? So, a few of the interesting things I had when I was doing it, you're told when you're an author submitting stories, read the requirements. Typically, you'll submit it on, well, back in the day, white paper, double spaced, 12-point font, a
yeah.
Times New Roman font, nothing unusual. And I received stuff on pink paper with weird fonts and everything. And then people saying, oh, I really like, so I'm publishing from the UK and I would get a lot of American submissions and people saying, well, I can't really see this being published in non-American spelling. Sorry, I really think my work should have American spelling. And I'm like, well, you're welcome to withdraw it if you want, but it's not going to happen, right? So have you seen anything sort of strange like that kind of?
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was sort of experienced the other side of the coin. When I was growing up as a kid, I read a lot of British authors like J.R.R. Tolkien and Richard Adams that wrote Watership Down. So I just kind of naturally used British spellings as a kid, and I had to unlearn them for the American market. I noticed my editors in the States were, switching all of my hooves back to hoofs and taking the U out of color and all these things.
Yeah.
The big one was gray. To me, Grey feels more gray than Gray. So I
Yeah.
prefer the EY.
I've never figured out that one, which was which. And
No, it's like you
to
took
this
some
day.
gray and poured milk into it and you got Gray.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, it's unusual for an American to have to learn American spellings later in life.
Yeah,
It's unusual.
yeah. Times New Roman, I'm old enough to remember, when it had to be in
Oh
courier on
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
typewriter. Make sure you use pica, not elite.
Oh geez. So you have been writing for a long time. Well, maybe that sounds like a not a nice thing to say. I'm not making any age judgments, but I mean
It's true.
since you were a child, it sounds like. So what inspired your initial writing and then did you continue because it sounds like from your experience in Japan that you were writing all the way through that as well. So that
Yes.
writing has just always been something that's sort of inspired you. Has it been an outlet or how have you used your writing?
It is something I've just done all my life. From the minute I knew what books and stories were as a baby, I knew this is what I want to do. I want to spend my life making this. I had the good fortune to grow up in a house full of books. My mom was an elementary school librarian, and my dad opened our town's first bookstore.
Wow.
So
Okay.
I just grew up among piles of books and just naturally loved them when you have parents that love books that much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I just
imagine.
knew I wanted to make stories.
Oh, that's great. Were you always interested in science fiction fantasy, or did you have other interests when you started?
I think I've always liked the speculative fiction. Speculative fiction sort of encompasses horror, fantasy, science fiction. I'm really not a big science fiction reader. I'm much more in the fantasy realm and some horror. Just, I don't know, I think I loved fairy tales as a kid. I loved monster stories, movies like King Kong. That fascinated me, this idea of this giant wall on Skull Island and what's behind the wall. Why do we need a wall of this size? So, again, the unknown. things like that have just always intrigued me. And it seems to me that we live in a supernatural world. So I heard the writer Peter Straub say that we read and write fantasy because it's the genre most capable of showing us life as it really is.
Mm.
I think that's pretty significant that
Yeah, that's interesting.
genre is fantasy.
Yeah. I think hopefully we'll get into that a little bit later, but that is interesting because it says a lot of things, I think. If you can interpret that many different ways, can't you? Including the reflection of ourselves and our society, which tries to make everything quite mundane
Yeah.
and sort of very plain.
Mm.
And, we're discovering more and more that, I mean, recently there's been a whole bunch of discoveries in science with the help of AI and the quantum computers and the new telescopes and everything, and just finding out that, well, the whole thing is a lot stranger than we believed.
Yeah.
So, at what point, so you've been writing since a kid, at what point did you decide that, oh, maybe I'll start publishing some of these things?
It was always kind of the goal. I learned the business part of writing, or started learning it, from my mom. She was always trying to sell her stories. And she was, as an elementary librarian, she was mostly interested in children's fiction. So she was always trying to publish her picture book and other stories, short stories for children. And so I grew up watching her, and this is the days of the postal mail. So send off those manila envelopes
Right.
with the manuscript and the self-addressed stamped envelope inside, and then watching the mailbox because you always wanted to get a reply from the publisher. And if you saw your big manila envelope come back, you would know, oh, it's probably my manuscript being returned. But what you hoped for was your smaller business sized envelope, because that might be a contract or a personal letter, something like that.
Yeah, there's definitely something romantic about those days for the authors, yet I still don't miss them. I'd rather submit by email or something than.
I do and I don't. It always felt more like real publishing when you could hold the physical thing in your hands when
Right.
you get a magazine or a book. And so I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
get quite the satisfaction from e-publishing that I used to, but I still do. I mean, if people are reading it, that's what's important.
Yeah, I know. I do definitely agree that there is that romance, that feeling of that tangibility, but yet I'm not fond of preparing the documents that way.
Yeah.
So
And it's
from that
nice to
point
be
of view,
able
I'm
to get
happy.
responses more quickly. I certainly don't miss the carbon copies and
Yeah.
making a mistake and having to retype the whole page.
No, exactly, exactly. So I'm curious with your latest book, The Country Under Heaven. It's actually quite interesting. And I was wondering, first of all, I guess, in terms of your writing routine and the way you approach books, would you consider yourself more of a pantser or a plotter? Do you outline them in great detail? Because this particular book is episodic and yet it still follows on through the main character's life. So it's not like it's jarring or anything in that regards.
I'm definitely more of a pantser.
Oh,
I
okay.
have to discover the story as I go along. I've tried before to plot something out in isolation and it just goes flat for me. I lose interest. So I have to be discovering the story along with the characters by following them around and seeing what they do as they encounter different situations. And
Yeah.
you're right. This book, especially, was created in kind of a strange way because it was originally a short story first that was published somewhere. And then I later, a couple years later, realized I wanted to tell more stories about this main character. I first conceived it as a novel in stories. And that's a little bit harder sell in today's publishing world. Book publishers would rather have a novel. So
Mm.
then I worked to unify it and make it a cohesive whole rather than a bunch of individual pieces. But you can still clearly see the pieces in the different chapters.
Yeah, and I was curious because there is some interesting things in addition to just the structure, and some of them would speak to the amount of research you might have had to do, but maybe it all speaks to the research. But for example, it's set in the Wild West, and that means you've had to research presumably the land, the lay of the land, the way of speaking. But I was curious of something in particular, which was the lack of speech marks.
Yeah,
Was that an intentional choice, or did it sort of flow from the feel of the writing of the prose?
I suppose it was largely intentional, but also flowed from the writing voice. So normally when I write, or at least until I wrote this book, probably, I was always most intrigued by settings. Some setting or place is what attracts me about a story. And I start exploring that place, and then all the other elements have come together, like characters and plot, etc. This book was the first time that the character's voice came to me first. I just heard this main character's voice speaking to me. Here was a character with a story that needed telling. And so the book is very reflective of how Ovid Vesper, the character, talks. And I want my purpose in not using quotation marks is that I wanted it to feel very oral. I wanted it to create the feel that we are listening to this cowboy talk. So it's not a written form, it's something we're hearing.
And did you research the patterns of dialogue and the types of words they use at the period then?
Yes, yes, I did a lot of that. Of course, when you can get original sources, firsthand sources, there's no substitute for that. So I read some pioneer diaries when people were moving into the American West. Newspapers encouraged people to keep diaries, chronicle your adventures as you move out west. And so a lot of people did this, particularly a lot of women did this because I think they were the ones that had maybe the time to do it, although they were plenty busy trying to survive. But and so they would write these accounts, and they would be sometimes serialized in newspapers. And so reading those, you get that in your ear of how people spoke, because it was this interesting mix of rural and sort of country plain simple folk, and yet any education people had tended to be pretty classical. They might have been
Yeah.
learning some Latin in or something from an old eclectic reader. So you get this strange blend of formal high speech and country speech. And for me as an American, I think it's a pretty natural outgrowth. Some things haven't changed that much. I grew up in the rural Midwest in Illinois, so I grew up among farmers. And I don't know that they talk that much differently now than they did in the 1800s. Of course, a little different.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I'm not sure what it
Yeah.
means exactly, but yeah, no,
But
it definitely feels like it's narrated as you read it. For sure, you can really get into the voice of the character, and you can feel the way the rhythm of the speech as well. Yeah.
there's also a series of videos on YouTube that is about Appalachian speech. And so I drew pretty heavily on that too for some of the expressions characters use.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah. You can
Yeah.
find anything on the social media these days, can't you?
Yeah, that's true.
That's excellent.
You mentioned the research. Also, I felt it was very important to research the plants and animals of an area because in different parts of the book, the character is traveling through different parts of the West. And so it was really important for me to research what plants, what flowers, what trees were there and in season when, and even pictures of them, what they looked like.
Okay,
Because
yeah, because I did notice that you paid attention to the plant life, especially, and I was quite curious how much research went into that because I thought, wow, it must be real because someone's going to call you on that. You
oh
know
yes,
it. So
yeah. Any details like
yeah,
things about firearms, there are fans out there who, if you get the number of bullets wrong or something, they are going to tell you about it.
especially in the US.
Yes, I suppose so.
Yeah, I think America's become infamous for that with regards to writers and their
Yeah,
fans. Even in your European writers, like if my main fan base is American, I have got to get all my details on the guns right.
yeah, that's right.
Did
Because a lot of
you?
people maybe still own these guns,
Yeah, yeah,
still,
exactly.
still Old West firearms in collections.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. Did you, when you went to publish this one, did you look for Big Five representation? Did you seek out one of the big publishing houses, or how did you approach the publishing process? Did you think to self-publish at all, or did you go for an agent and look for smaller
Fortunately,
pub?
at this stage in my career, I have an agent who handles the submissions for me. When I was publishing my first book back in, I guess it was published in 1999,
Oh, yeah.
that was doing the research, sending cold submissions over the transom into the publishing house slush pile. But since then, I've worked with the same agency ever since then, and I'm very blessed. Agents are definitely worth their weight in gold and then some because they know the people, they know who's looking for what. So
That
that part of the process is about the easiest for me now.
that's really interesting because I imagine that whole thing. I mean, started getting into writing around 2006, sort of the beginning of the ebook self-publishing revolution kind of thing. Prior to that, I imagine that the whole process of it, like agents weren't as necessary, I don't think, before that. And they seem to have become this gatekeeper to the publishing houses in many ways.
That's,
So you must have been around sort of as this whole thing shifted. As you said, you didn't really necessarily use an agent initially.
I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, I was looking for an agent from square one, but yeah, I didn't have an agent at first. And that's kind of miraculous how that first book got published because I did everything wrong. The book was called Dragonfly. It was my first novel, and I'm kind of strange in that I was able to publish a novel before I was publishing short stories. Usually writers do it the other way around. They work their way up to a novel.
Right.
But I always wanted to tell longer stories. So I had this novel that I was submitting. And in the case of the first publication, I had not failed to do my homework. I sent it to Arkham House, which is a small press that had been around ever since the pulp era. Arkham House was mostly formed to publish the work of H.P. Lovecraft because he had been published in the periodicals of the day. And you know how stories in magazines will have a certain life in that issue and then they start vanishing into the
Right.
past.
Yeah.
So there were people that wanted to preserve Lovecraft's stories. So they created this Arkham House. In the industry, it's a great place to be published. It's small, but there's a certain prestige to it.
Hmm.
At that time, Arkham House wanted collections of stories by the old masters of fantasy and horror. And I was sending them a novel. And I wasn't an old master. I was a kid who hadn't
Right.
published much of anything yet. So I did several things wrong. They only wanted to see agented manuscripts, and I had no agent, and I sent them a manuscript. But I guess it just hit the right editor at the right time. And for some reason, he pulled it out of the slush pile.
Oh, jeez. Yeah. Sometimes, yeah, it's just got to do it enough to be in the right place at the right time.
That's it. You just keep sending things out one way or another. And if you get enough things going, sooner or later, something's going to connect.
Yeah. Yeah. This book has been published by Melvin House. Maybe you could describe your experience with them. They're a smaller publisher, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
Melville House,
Oh,
actually.
sorry, Melvin.
Like
Thank you for
no,
correcting me.
no problem at all. But yeah, that too is kind of miraculous because they're mostly known as a literary publisher. They don't publish a lot of genre fiction. And this novel of mine is drenched in genre. It's a story with the supernatural and monsters and cowboys having shootouts.
Yeah.
I guess there's enough literary merit to it that between my agent and a very insightful editor at Melville House, who I'm very grateful to, they were able to convince their people to publish something a little different from their usual fare.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I can see the literary side to it because I mean, it's essentially a character's journey and attempt to overcome his past in a way or
Yeah,
find his place from that sort of monumental moment in the world. How have they been for the important part was the marketing, I guess. That's always the tricky part, isn't it?
they're wonderful about it. For the first time ever, I've had a team of publicists working with me. I've never had that before with other novels I've published. The publisher hopes you'll do what you can on your own to try to promote it, and they'll do certain things to promote it. But this is a team that's actually worked with me and set up interviews and made connections for me. And so I'm very grateful to them for that.
Well, that's pretty good, yeah. Because, like, I mean, as you say, it's pretty rare. There are some of the smaller publishing houses that are starting to differentiate themselves from the crowd. Are, I think, really doing it on the basis of their marketing and publicity, because that is what
Almost,
authors want, isn't it? I mean, in the end
yeah,
of the day.
sure. I almost wonder if the publishing industry itself is changing in that regard, that nowadays everyone is a potential media influencer. Everybody has a social media presence and these things. So I think maybe they're having to work harder to be heard over the noise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely sounds reasonable. There's so much noise out there in the social media landscape.
Yeah. It's probably easier than ever to publish in one way or another, but it's maybe even harder to get your work noticed in today's world.
I'm certain that's true, especially I mean, because you don't seem to write in series. So
Oh,
your book itself is a sort of episodic series, but it's a
yeah.
standalone.
Yeah, fortunately, I do have one series that is currently seeking a publisher, so it's not,
Okay.
I'm not opposed to writing series. But you're right that in the writing I've done, I've never really created a brand like some writers have. I write whatever I'm interested in, and what that means is my first novel was a dark fantasy. My second book was a middle grade reader for children. My third book was something else entirely, more of a literary fantasy. So, yeah, I haven't been my best friend in terms of finding a brand that publishers can latch onto. And my agent says my brand is really Frederic S Durbin. We need a Durbin section in bookstores.
Sometimes you just have to be true to yourself, don't you? I mean, some authors can write to the market, and I think many can't. And you need to sort of find the people who like your style of writing and are interested in whatever you're going to create next. I mean, they are out there. I think it's a matter of scale, isn't it? So the
Yeah.
big five will go for, well, the big five tend to go for celebrities, to be honest.
Yeah, they want a safe bet. They
Yeah.
want the next so and so.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah.
But yeah, I think you have to write what you're passionate about and the stories you want to tell. Because for one thing, trying to write for the market is kind of a doomed venture. By the time you get something to the market that you think is right for the market has moved on to something else.
Especially if you're doing it consciously, it's unnatural for yourself because then you'll spend a lot of time analyzing, okay, what is the market? How do I make my interests fit into that marketplace? Whereas if you're a natural in that way, it's less of a problem because you say, okay, I want to write that. I can fit it this way, and then you just go for it.
Yeah,
But not all of us are like that. So, yeah.
true.
So the book we're talking about today is The Country Under Heaven, which is going to be released very soon,
May 13th is the
May
release date.
13th. It's a Western, as we've suggested, but not a traditional one. So there are gunfights, but that's not the main purpose of it. It's not some roaming gunslinger going around from place to place, although he is roaming.
Yeah,
So maybe I'll let you summarize to the key elements of it, and then we can move on from
sure.
there.
Okay. Well, it's the story of a Union veteran of the Civil War. So he fought on the side of the North in the Civil War as a young man. This novel is set 20 years later, during the decade of the 1880s. And this main character, Ovid Vesper, at the Battle of Antietam, was blown through the air by an explosion. And ever since that moment, he's had a series of mysterious visions that seem to be leading him somewhere. They're not visions he can control, they just come to him at random times, but they tend to show him places and people, things he doesn't quite understand. He thinks that in his near death experience, some creature came into the world with him, like stepping through a door that's temporarily opened. When he was passing between worlds, he thinks something followed him in, and he keeps seeing this indistinct creature. He calls it the Crather. That's just his word for any living creature. So it's that story. And you're right, he's not a typical Western gunslinger. He's wrestling with his, I suppose, PTSD on some level in a country that's still reeling and deeply divided from the war. And so, in many ways, he's almost more like a pastor, like an itinerant pastor,
Mm.
where he's coming around, he's meeting some people from his past and helping them with various problems. They're usually a supernatural problem.
Yeah, I noticed that.
There, he has these interactions with creatures from other worlds and other dimensions.
Just before we get it going, the term Crather, where did you get that from?
So I've seen forms of the word before, and you might be able to speak to this better than I can, but I think there is some kind of a Gaelic word or
Hmm.
some word from England that is spelled like Creyth. And then I don't know if it's ER or UR, but it is sort of an early form of creature.
Yeah,
Um,
it seemed that
so I
way.
partly use that. I spell it in my book Craither. And it just sounds to me like the sort of thing that would have found its way into the American West, possibly,
Right,
because they
yeah.
strange, words from other countries. People were immigrants.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I
yeah.
wanted some word other than creature. I wanted to distinguish it somehow and give it an older time feel.
Yeah, no, no. That's interesting. You did mention in your emails that you're quite interested in the Western. I mean, obviously this was a Western. Now you haven't, I don't think you've written other Westerns, but you did have quite an interest in Westerns in general. So what was your interest in that regard? Because obviously it's a sort of a supernatural story in a way, and it's a story about a character like reconnecting, but why in the Western setting?
The West is something that's always intrigued me. I sometimes say that in the United States, we don't have a long history like you have in Europe. We don't have a fairy lore. We don't have a medieval history. So, the closest thing we have, at least for white people, the closest thing we have to a mythology or a fairy lore is the Western, the classical Western. So it's always intrigued me. I also had a father who loved the West, and where most kids grow up hearing sports stories, learning baseball or football or basketball from their fathers. I grew up hearing a lot of stories about the West. My dad was kind of like this frustrated cowboy that was born too late and too far east, but he owned horses. He wrote poetry as a young man about being on the trail and coyotes and these things. I'm not sure where his interest came from. I know he read a lot of Westerns in his younger days, but it was just always in my ears and in my consciousness growing up. And because it is such a part of American heritage, it intrigued me. And I think the West is fascinating, the West of that time period, because it was such a time of rapid change. It seems to me that our stories about the West, one reason they're so appealing is they're all kind of elegies. They're usually a sad, beautiful song about something lost or
Mm.
a way of life that's changing, things that we've lost and we can't get back, or people with regrets. And I'm glad that we've recently, in the past, I don't know, 20, 30 years, have started to take new looks at the West. We've kind of gotten rid of this sanitized image of the heroic cowboy and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
We realized that it was a very ugly time. There was a lot of injustice and abuse and mistreatment of native peoples and things like that. So I think now maybe we're finally telling our real stories of the West.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. Also, I think because we tend to, I don't know, at least from the outside, we tend to view the Wild West of the US as being this really extended period of time in the 1800s. And then when you look at it, it actually wasn't that long, was it? I mean, it was a few decades and then it sort of disappeared into, I
Yeah,
don't know, the American Industrial Revolution or something.
yeah, yeah. And I'm certainly not an authority on that, but I think you're right that it's not, it's kind of like how in this country we tend to think of the Middle Ages as one thing, the European Middle Ages, medieval times. And you're talking about this very long time period. Compared to that, the West is just this flicker, the Old West.
Yeah. It was
Because
interesting. Sorry, go
as soon
ahead.
as you laid rails, as soon as you got trains and easier transportation and the land was parceled out, the West became something entirely different. There weren't these big empty sections on the map anymore.
Yeah. It's interesting the romance of the Wild West, where you have, like you say, sort of juxtaposed to violence. And I mean, it maybe in some ways the elements of that are still in American society now. If you think of, you don't show so much the romance part, but you have like the lone cowboy, riding on the range, that kind of, you've mentioned kind of the knight errant as an
Yeah.
equivalent. But then you also have, and you do show this in your story as well, the way that that is kind of corrupted, like the lack of a, let's say, legal, social, governmental structure in that area leads to people just, you just get a big enough group together and you can take what you want, more or less. We've got people
Yeah.
taking entire towns and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we've got this, and usually in the movies and things, it's the gunslinger
Mhm.
juxtaposed against the very black and white view, isn't it?
Yeah.
But in some ways, I was just thinking that it kind of feels like maybe that still exists under the radar in a way.
Yeah.
It's just because we're sort of the townspeople, and then there's just a battle going on. It's just that now all of the people fighting, well, I guess they were at that time, are so much, let's say, richer or more powerful than us, right? But I guess even in the Wild West, that dynamic was there, wasn't it? You've got the rich guy gets his gang together and leads them in to take over the town or whatever it is. So seeds of modern America. present even
But
then. I don't know.
yes, frighteningly.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think I like that comparison to the knight errant. They're in a way like King Arthur stories, where a person that has virtue and personal integrity can make a real difference in an area that's largely without law, where people are making their own law. Someone good who comes along is a good hero, and you can tell these iconic elemental stories of the struggle of good and evil. And you have this wonderful setting to work with. You have these beautiful deserts and mountains and big sky and the horse culture and so
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting as well. I was thinking of that and the comparison between the European, let's say, stories of knights versus the cowboys. And it does speak to the age of, as you were mentioning earlier, of the two areas, with US being very new and very young
yeah.
and Europe being much older. And you think if you compare those stories, the cowboy, even the heroic cowboy, is largely riding through a wilderness in a relatively primitive setting, even when he gets to the towns. Whereas you then go to the European mythos, like the Arthurian legends and stuff, and they're all like castles. It's all, basically cities develop. I mean, they ride through wilderness as well,
Uh-huh.
but I mean, they're going from castle to castle often, these big, and so it kind of speaks to the relative age of the different lands as well, doesn't it? Which is
It does.
interesting. I think it's
And
interesting that we also romanticize those two in our relative lands. It's almost like we want to stay in those eras to some degree, although, I mean, neither of them would be particularly wonderful for the average person for a
mhm.
variety of reasons. Yeah.
I think there's kind of a spiritual dimension that's interesting to explore too. When you look at the Arthurian legends in Europe, there are close ties with Christianity. These knights felt that they were on a holy mission and given these holy quests by God. You can sort of treat that same kind of thinking almost in stories of the Wild West, where there was much more biblical literacy and church literacy. The comparisons to biblical stories just sort of draw themselves. Whether people were Christian believers or not, they were aware of the language and the stories of Christianity.
Yeah. And a lot of the community life would have revolved around the church, wouldn't it? At the
Yes.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
You did have a one chapter where they burned down the church, one of the bad guys, didn't they?
Yeah.
It was quite a dramatic.
Sure. And that's kind of symbolic that he says, I'm all the church these people need.
Yeah.
Devotion and their worship in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. Something else that's interesting to me, you mentioned in the email the pathless wilderness is vanishing as fences going up. Very true. And I mean, you see that in Europe. So I'm Canadian by background. It's probably somewhat obvious to you, but I grew up in rural Canada. So living in England I still haven't fully adjusted, let's say, within my soul. Let's put it that way, metaphorically. I miss certain, let's say, openness of the land.
Yes.
And what I see, and I agree with what you're discussing in the email with the wilderness vanishing, and we're reaching, I think, a point in society, right? So when we had the chaos, let's say post Civil War, all the conflicts and the development in the home state, people could escape to somewhere in the Wild West, start homesteading somewhere. There isn't really anywhere to escape from the current chaos anymore, is there? Everything's owned, everything's parceled up, and as you mentioned, fenced off. Feel like that's part of the issue in a way is we don't have anywhere to go now. It's all, and we're just getting compressed, it feels like, and, in some kind of vice.
I think for me that was one of the hardest things about living in Japan is it is hard to find any place outdoors in Japan where you don't see other people.
Right.
I also miss those really open spaces and actually having solitude in nature. And yeah, so I think that's a big appeal of the West also, that it was a land you could lose yourself in. Daniel
Yeah.
Boone famously said, if I can see the smoke from my neighbor's chimney, they're too close.
Yeah, I can appreciate that for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I do wonder if this lack of space is a contributing factor to some of what's going on in our
Yeah.
society. People they just need
Well,
somewhere
and
to,
it ties back to what's happening in the digital world also, in the world of screens and social media,
right.
that especially we notice it with our students, is they are very isolated, in that everybody is on their own little screen, and yet they really don't have solitude. It's an
Mm,
isolation without solitude.
it's
They're always getting input and things are coming in. They're looking at videos and things and all this influence from other people who may
Yeah,
not.
that's an interesting way of putting it, and I do see that for sure. Like you say, sort of isolated on their one screen in front of them, and yet that is a portal. It's almost like the rest of
Yeah,
the senses don't matter in a way. Everything comes through that portal of a screen into their brain, kind of thing,
yeah.
which
It's
is an
like
idea
sitting
for
on
it.
the floor of Grand Central Station during rush hour and thinking you're going to have some kind of peace or be able to concentrate.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's unusual. And they're trying to parcel that up even more as well with things like metaverse and all that
Mm,
kind of stuff. No, it's interesting. So your book also does take place after the Civil War. So the main character is fought in the Union, if I remember correctly,
yeah,
or fought for the Union. So the Civil War was obviously a very tumultuous time in U.S. history and sort of played the backdrop to this. Something I'm interested in is kind of parallels that we've been talking about modern society, parallels with the Wild West. And it in England here, with our governments doing weird things, there's more and more talk of potential for civil war. And clearly the tribalism that's built in the US and much of the rest of the West leads one to at least think of the possibility. I'm just wondering, do you see like parallels between now and then in this regard? I mean, I know the US Civil War was a localized one, but I think what we're kind of seeing is all countries are kind of wondering about some kind of civil war nowadays, all Western countries anyway. But the problem that also then is with the Civil War, as with Ovid, is it Ovid or how do you pronounce it?
I say Ovid,
Ovid? Okay.
but that's mostly because my classics teacher in college called the figure in Roman history Ovid, the
Okay.
Roman poet.
I wasn't quite sure how to pronounce it. But so Ovid escapes his, well, tries to escape his part in the Civil War and then reconnect with his community. But also, as we said, by going out into the open spaces. But if we're going to have our civil wars now, not that I want them, but let's say they come, there isn't really anywhere to escape to anymore as well. So, but do you see that kind of atmosphere and feeling within society as well, or am I just sort of being paranoid?
Very much so, yes. As with the Civil War in history, this was a war that would often set families against each other. You might have brothers, and one fought for the North and one fought for the South. So you had this real tension, even among families and people who used to be friends. And we're seeing that very same thing in the States today over politics. You have people that are right wing and people that are left wing, and you have these families that say, don't come home at Christmas time because we don't want to see you. And so, yeah, it's a hotbed, and it's a very tragic situation today.
Yeah, yeah. And something else that was interesting is when I was looking into it, because obviously the Civil War was primarily about slavery. There is the quote by Lincoln that says he would save the Union even if he couldn't save any of the slaves. So
Yeah,
it might have been about slavery, but there was always that other layer that maybe was more dominant.
sure.
And this speaks to propaganda and narratives because once he repackaged it as a freedom issue, it changed the narrative of the Civil War entirely. And you see that happening with the wars being fought now. Over here, at least with regards to Russia, Ukraine, and I'm not taking any stances on who's right or who's wrong there. I mean, we can always say it's wrong to invade another country, but then we have to go challenge ourselves as well, don't we? The narrative that's being pushed over here in the UK is really wrapping that conflict, Russia, Ukraine, around the packaging from World War II, is what we're seeing. So they're trying to equate the two, even though you can make a lot of cases that there's a lot of difference between them. And well, maybe the US is behaving the same. I don't know. But big money is still winning in a large way. But it's interesting to think about the way that narratives are written in regards to conflicts as well.
Mm,
And this, I guess, speaks to us as writers in a way, isn't it? Do you ever see yourself writing propaganda for the government?
no, I hope not. I really believe that storytelling is storytelling, and that you write stories because they're good stories that want to be told. And I don't think you should ever have some kind of ulterior motive for writing a story.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not always true, is it?
Right? No, unfortunately, it's not. And you really have to be careful that you're not propagating some cultural assumption that's just not right or not true. That's
Yeah.
why we're grateful for sensitivity readers
Yeah.
who go through and tell us areas in which we're being insensitive to something.
It's so difficult these days. Even the sensitivity readers often will have biases, won't they, in some ways?
Maybe I don't have enough experience with them, but
Yeah, no, it's a difficult one. So as Ovid is going through his journey post
uh-huh.
Civil War, and he's reconnecting with society, just sort of learning where he fits in again, he is pursued by the Crather. This puts him through a number of because he in the story he has the vision, which is an ability to see visions, as you
Yeah.
said, that he doesn't necessarily control. And so he puts him in a number of scenarios that are, let's say, supernatural, or we could describe them in many different ways, interestingly, as a science fiction podcast. One thing that came to mind, especially during the tornado scene, where they were talking about, moving faster and catching up to the creature's, let's say, speed, or as some people might put it, vibrational frequencies.
Yeah.
So you have these different aspects of reality overlapping on each other. So,
Mm.
so I'm just curious on your personal perspective. You did touch on it earlier. Do you feel like, first of all, how did you view that? Did you view that more of as a supernatural or as a multiversal thing, or like, let's say, different vibrational frequencies? Or is that even just a unhelpful distinction? And in reality, they're all the same, just different interpretations of the same thing.
Mm. It's true that I'm not much of a science fiction writer, so I'm probably not thinking much about multiverses.
Right.
It's probably more of a spiritual, supernatural storytelling, I think.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because I've been so in some of the stuff I'm developing now, I'm quite interested in let's say frequencies, vibrational states, and things like that,
Yeah,
which I think well, it would lend to either. I feel that interpretation is almost in the middle of the other two in some ways.
it's true.
Kind of
You're
interesting that you did have that in the one.
Yeah,
And
you're right that that chapter is probably the closest to science fiction
yeah,
because the whole idea of that chapter is I wanted to weave in a piece of American folklore. We have this folkloric figure in American culture called Windwagon Smith, and he's one of these figures like Paul Bunyan that you tell tall tales about. He's based on probably a couple of real people that actually lived. The idea is that he took a wagon, like a covered wagon, and put a sail on it and used the wind of the prairie to make this thing go. I wanted to use Windwagon Smith as a character that Ovid meets. So
okay.
that lent itself well to this idea of the tornado and then these creatures that are moving faster than we move in our frame of reference or our dimension. And so, in order to interact with them, you have to get up to the right speed. So, they use this wind wagon to accelerate.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm curious if that would ever work.
I mean, to a degree, it would work, but you really can't control the wind. Like, it's not going to take you door to door.
Yeah, because
You
like,
know when it's
do you
going to stop.
outside of a tornado, is there enough wind there? I don't know.
I don't know how steady it is, but there is a lot of wind. We do a lot with windmills and
Right.
power generation and things like that. But
Guess you're
yeah, I
similar
don't
to
think
us
it
over
would
here
be
then.
reliable transportation on land, probably.
Yeah. It's cool if it was though.
The sea, the ocean has kind of a uniform medium. I know there are different conditions and storms and such, but the land also has this environment where you come up against rocks and terrain and mountains and things and valleys. So,
Yeah, it's just fun to think about. It was an
oh yeah,
interesting piece. So I guess before we get to the big question, as we're running long on time, I have to talk a bit more on the Crather because it's an interesting entity, and it does follow him from that, as you mentioned, that sort of explosion when he was thrown back in the Civil War. And so there is this trying to figure out what it is, not only from the reader perspective, but also from the main character perspective. So a few things. I mean, well, I won't get into the spoilers of it, but there is something that suggests it's a real entity, but that not necessarily. This is fiction, so it can be interpreted many ways. Something I was thinking. I mean, it feels like a specter of death for much of the story, like
yeah.
literally the embodiment of death following him around to some degree. Also, to some degree, feels like it could be maybe that he had a psychotic break of some kind or trauma, and that would make him an unreliable narrator in
Mm-hmm.
his interpretation. Did you have any of these thoughts? And do any of those ideas sound interesting or plausible?
They do
So,
sound very interesting. And I don't know that I consciously thought about Ovid as an unreliable narrator, but I think you might be right. In some ways, we all have our own way of seeing the world. And maybe we're all unreliable narrators, especially when you've been through an experience like a war. But yeah, I think it's very intriguing. And as you say, I won't give spoilers as to exactly what the Crather is, but I sort of have my ideas, but I think it's good that the reader has some latitude for making interpretations of the reader's own.
yeah, and it always leaves it open to English classes discussing your book, doesn't
Oh, sure. Yeah. You want to make it ambiguous enough that the professors will have something to talk about.
it? Exactly.
One thing I also think we probably should mention is the title of the book is called The Country Under Heaven. And so maybe that is Ovid's answer to some of these problems of not being able to get away from the turmoil of our past. There's a certain transcendent element to the book that
Hmm.
what brings in his calm and his peace as he deals with people is he's kind of looking beyond this world, and he firmly believes there's a better place beyond this one and after this life. And so in a way he's always pointing people toward that. We're not that it's an overtly Christian book, but it certainly has some Christian applicability, I think, in the
Yeah,
same way
yeah,
that like the Lord of the Rings does.
right.
This book looks to a light beyond and the undying land in the West and stuff. And so, we're not there yet. We're not in heaven, but we're in sort of on the doorstep. We're in the country under heaven.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, no, there's definitely the undertones there for sure. So I just wanted to touch on the big question then, and then we'll finish up with you a chance to plug your work. So as we mentioned, the Wild West was a time of, well, it was a time of great development, homesteading, moving west,
Mhm.
conquering the land in many ways. And it comes with many horrors and abuses as well in this time of American expansion. And all that ultimately led to the modern US, and for better or for worse, it depends on your
Yeah.
perspective, right? Now we are in another period that has similarities to that, as we've been talking about, although we're lacking this opportunity for expansionism right now, barring any great advances by SpaceX or NASA.
Mhm.
I'm curious, so with the conflicts we have now and these limitations, what do you think that our path forward should be for us to, let's say, reach beyond this and, if it's possible, once again, enter that land of hope and optimism, maybe ideally expansion. Well, I don't know, expansionism is a bad term these days, but let's say prosperity at least for America and for humanity in general, because these may not be the same thing as we might be seeing now.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's a big question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I mean, partly maybe I started to answer it with the idea of the country under heaven, that what Ovid does is he sees people. And so he's ministering in a way to people and their individual needs, showing compassion, being a friend, being loyal. Maybe there's some answer in that, that we can't fix the whole world, but we can interact with the part that's right around us. We can love people. We can be the best that we can be. And so I think maybe there's some light and potential for healing in that. The world isn't something out there. The world is, the song says, we are the world.
Right.
So the world begins with, the person right next to you.
Yeah, no,
And
I think that's an important observation. So the reconnecting with community, basically, which was what Ovid was doing, wasn't he?
yeah.
In many ways, as
And
well.
one thing that kind of surprised me in my research is, we tend to think of, oh, those were terrible times, we abused the Native Americans, and that's true, we certainly did. But there were people even then who kind of had the right view of things. Like when you think about the treatment of, say, the I don't even know how to pronounce this, the Nez Perce or the Nez Perce Indians is a tribe of Indians in kind of the northwest of America, the United States. And so there was this war, like so many cases of dealing with the Native Americans, where people were pushed off their land and stuff. And there were people even then who really opposed that. They said that wasn't so much a war, that was a crime.
Mm.
And I was surprised that there were voices even then writing to newspaper editors. And I mentioned Pioneer Diaries. I read the diary of Sarah Raymond Herndon, who crossed the Great Plains by covered wagon with her family in 1865. And she was horrified by some of the sentiment against Native Americans that she encountered even then. She met some guy who said, I would sooner shoot an Indian than a good dog or something. And she's like, where is that coming from? Why do you feel that way toward other people?
Yeah, yeah, it's those sentiments are strange. They still exist too, don't they, in many
They
places? Well,
do.
as we seem to be becoming more tribal. But it is interesting to look back because I've been doing more of that in the last few years, looking back sort of in the 1700s and 1800s, and you do encounter, let's say, the beginnings of social justice movements. So you get sort of general suffrage leading into emancipation and sort of attempting abolition of slavery, moving into women's suffrage, etc. I don't know what it says because underlying that, or perhaps overlaying that, are all the wars and all the power struggles that go on. And it's
Yeah.
almost like maybe it's taken us a long time to realize that the enemy is really the power structures rather than other people. And we're trying to do the right thing. And a lot of people are trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And it just keeps getting torn apart all the time, which is a sad thing to end on,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll give you one more question. What would be your future of humanity? Let's say an ideal future, ideal but somewhat realistic future, since this is a science fiction show. Let's say in 500 years, because that's a time that we're either going to be extinct or we're going to have overcome a lot of issues.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's a tough question because as a Christian myself, I don't believe that we're ever going to have a perfect time in human history. I don't think things will get better in this world as we know it. The Bible pretty much tells us that things are spiraling down and they're going to get worse and worse until the end of things when the creation is made new. So I guess my vision of hope is to have a faith, to have a faith, a Christian faith in my case. I don't know that I would write about a utopia or a better human situation because I don't really think that's going to happen.
Right.
I hope we can get past this tribalism because you're right. It's terrifying that when bad voices are the loudest and people accept those and follow them, that's not a good thing for a country.
It's interesting, and I know we're at the end, and I keep prolonging this, but I'm interested in this topic because it sort of speaks to some of the world building I've been doing on mine
Yeah.
in terms of, what is the nature of reality and within a context of multiple religions. And as you say, like if you're Christian, for example, you're kind of expecting you have to work through this world in order to get to the next one, earn your way to the next one in a way.
Yeah.
Or yeah, I guess earn it would be the right way, have the right views and the right behavior, etc. Does that suggest that, as you were maybe commenting on, that this world can't reach another level because it's kind of set to be this test? So what I was wondering was then, do you think that this world, we can't really fully improve this world because it's a test, like in a Christian context at least, for getting to the next plane, realm, state, whatever. So then this world is kind of doomed to stay this way, and it's us that have to improve ourselves to move on to a better place.
Well, I think it has to come from outside. I don't think we can improve ourselves. And, that's kind of what makes Christianity different from other religions is that, we know we rely on some outside help if things are going to get better. So, when you look at Tolkien, he's always my great example of how to tell a story and
Mm.
um, how in destroying the ring, Frodo can't do it himself. That it's this what Tolkien called catastrophe, which is a catastrophe that has EU in front of it, meaning like, a miraculous turn toward the good because of this transcendent outside help.
Mm. Yeah, he wouldn't have succeeded without his bad side jumping into that lava, right? Yeah.
Yeah, like Gandalf says, Gollum has some part to play for good or ill before this is all over.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think we're about out of time for today. It has been great chatting with you. But before we go, perhaps you could let us know if you have any upcoming books. Remind us again of the release date of this book. And if you
Yeah,
have any in works as well, let us know. And where we
sure.
might find you online and if you'll be at any upcoming events or the new interviews you're doing as well or anything like that.
Okay. Well, let's see. So the forthcoming book is called The Country Under Heaven, and that's coming out from Melville House on May 13th. And that's the story about the American West with monsters and the supernatural. I'm hoping that the publisher will publish the sequel to that book also, which is already written. It's called The Thunder and the Light. At least that's the working title, but that'll probably still a few years out. We have to see how well the first book does first. And I have various things in the works. Those are probably the most pertinent right now. My website is fredericsdurbin.com. And the Frederic is just Frederic. It looks like Fred Eric S. Durbin. I don't have a really big social media presence, unfortunately, but I guess that's the place to find me and my bibliography and things. I'm also on Amazon and, wherever you buy books, you can find me and my books, I think.
Excellent. Yeah. Frederic S. Durbin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real joy to talk with you.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.